The dead do not argue back. That was what made it fun. Captain Drevashin had always believed that the best victories were the ones you could enjoy slowly, like a meal left warm on the table for as long as you wished. He had fought in 11 campaigns across 6 star systems. He had seen cities burn from orbit. He had watched species beg, negotiate, collapse, and vanish. But none of those victories had ever felt quite as satisfying as this one. The one where the enemy did not even have the dignity to leave behind a fight. Earth was below him, turning the way it always had, slow and blue and scarred. From orbit it still looked almost peaceful. Almost. If you did not know what to look for, you might think it was just another inhabited world going about its business. But Ashin knew better. He had been here 30 years ago when the Coalition fleet finished the job. He had watched the last human transmission cut to static. He remembered the silence that followed, total and clean, like the silence after a door is shut forever. Now he had returned simply because he could, because his patrol route curved past this system and he had a little time to spare. Because there was a kind of pleasure in revisiting old victories, the way some beings kept trophies on a wall. He opened a broad-spectrum channel, not aimed at anyone in particular, just open, cast wide into the void, the way you might shout something amusing into an empty room just to hear your own voice echo. 30 years, he said, leaning back in his command chair, his long gray fingers folded across his chest. 30 years, and the planet still sits here, turning, as if it is waiting for something. It is not waiting for anything. There is nothing left to wait. Humanity is gone, and I was there to watch it go. His own crew chuckled. A few of them had not been born when the siege happened, but they had heard the stories. Every young Varric officer had. It was one of the great tales of Coalition history. The humans had been resourceful, they said, inventive, stubborn beyond reason. They had fought until they had nothing left to fight with, and then they had simply stopped existing. It was almost admirable, if you were the sort to admire insects for their persistence before you swept the nest away. On the ship beside his, Captain Barrow INDT of the Golthy heavy cruiser Undying Reach picked up the open channel and decided to add his voice. INDT was a large being, wide-shouldered, slow-speaking, and deeply comfortable with his own importance. His ship was the biggest of the 5 in the loose formation. He liked people to know that. I fired the 9th volley, NDT said, in his usual flat rumble, as if he were reading off a repair manifest. 9th volley of the 3rd wave. My crew and I. The Central Command relay went dark 12 seconds after impact. That was the end of their coordinated resistance. 12 seconds. That is all it took, after all their talk of defending their home world. Captain Sorlamine of the Thurvi Light Frigate listened to both of them without comment. She was not the sort to celebrate loudly. She was the sort to watch, to assess, to quietly store away everything she observed for future use. She had been a junior sensor officer 30 years ago during the siege, not a captain, just a girl at a console, watching data scroll past. She had not found the humans particularly impressive as a fighting force. What she had found interesting, briefly, was how long they kept reorganizing after each engagement. Every time you broke one formation, another appeared somewhere else. Smaller, weaker, but there. Like the planet was trying to cough them back up. Then it stopped. And that was that. She said nothing on the channel, but she did not close it either. She listened, and she watched her sensors out of habit, the way old analysts always do. Captain Olav Reth of the 2nd Thurvi Frigate was more vocal than mean, but less theatrical than Ashin. She joined the broadcast with a brief observation that the humans had never understood the scale of what they were facing. She had reviewed their final transmissions once, years ago, and what struck her was not the desperation in them, but the confusion. They genuinely did not seem to understand that they had already lost. They kept making plans. They kept issuing orders, right up until the signal stopped. It was, she said, almost sad. The way a child keeps drawing pictures after you have told them the paper will run out. Captain Grail Toss said very little. He was the youngest of the 5, still earning his place in the informal hierarchy of captains who had actually been present for the siege. He had arrived late, in the final hours, and had fired only a few salvos before the resistance ended. He did not feel the same comfortable ownership over the memory that Ashin or INDT did. He laughed when the others laughed, and he agreed when agreement seemed appropriate. But inside his chest there was something small and quiet that he could not name. He pushed it down and kept it there. Below them all, Earth continued to turn. The cities were ruins now, worn down by 30 years of weather and silence. Green things had begun to reclaim the edges of them. Forests pushing back through cracked roads, rivers rerouting through broken infrastructure, the old planet going about its slow business with or without anyone to watch. It looked almost like it was healing. Ashen found that mildly offensive. A grave should look like a grave. He was about to suggest they fire a commemorative volley into the surface, just for ceremony, just to mark the occasion, when something on the far side of the system caught Sorlamin's attention. Not on the sensors. The sensors showed nothing at all. Not a flicker, not a ghost, not a single anomalous reading. What caught her attention was the absence. The gravitational background of the outer system was reading clean. Too clean. Slightly too smooth. In a way she could not put into precise words. She ran the reading again. Then a third time. Nothing. Flat emptiness. Exactly as expected. She almost said something. She had the words formed. She very nearly spoke them. Then Ashen was laughing again, and INDT was describing the exact trajectory of his ninth volley in loving detail. And the moment passed, and Mean said nothing. She filed the reading away in the back of her mind and told herself she was imagining things. 30 years of peace had made her cautious in ways that were no longer useful. She was not imagining things. 41,000 kilometers behind the coalition formation, in a darkness so complete and so deliberate that no instrument in the known galaxy could have found it, 1,400 ships waited. They had no running lights. They emitted no heat. Their drives were throttled down to nothing, running on a technology that scattered every emission signature into patterns indistinguishable from the natural background radiation of deep space. They had been running this way for 11 days, since they crossed the outer edge of the system. They had been building toward this moment for 30 years. In the command chair of the lead vessel, a woman named Hara Soldin sat very still and listened to Drev Ashen's voice coming over the open broadcast. She had a cup of water in her hand that she had not drunk for an hour. Her eyes were fixed on the display ahead of her, which showed the 5 coalition ships in clean tactical resolution, their positions, their headings, their utterly relaxed formation. Ships at rest, ships at ceremony, ships that had not raised a single defensive shield since entering the system. Beside her, Commander Sarah Vane stood at the tactical station and did not move either. She was listening too. Ashen was saying something about the smell of the atmosphere during the final bombardment. How it had been visible from orbit, the plumes of particulate rising from the surface. How it had looked almost artistic. Soldin set her water cup down very carefully on the armrest. She did not look at Vane. She did not need to. She nodded once. Vane's hands moved to the console, and 1,400 ships began, in perfect silence, their final approach. There is a difference between a species that is defeated and a species that has decided to disappear. The Coalition never learned that difference. That was their mistake, and it was a quiet one, the kind of mistake that sits in a dark room for 30 years before it stands up and introduces itself. When the siege ended and the last signal from Earth went silent, the Coalition filed its reports, updated its charts, marked humanity as extinct, and moved on. There were other campaigns to run, other species to negotiate into submission or bomb into compliance. The galaxy was large and full of problems that required attention. A dead planet was not one of them. They closed the file on humanity and did not open it again. What they did not know, what no sensor in their vast network ever detected, was that the file had been closed on the wrong thing. In the years before the siege, a group of human strategists and scientists had been watching the Coalition's expansion with the cold, careful attention of people who have already accepted a terrible conclusion and are now simply working out what to do about it. They had no illusions about winning the coming war. The Coalition was too large, too organized, too far ahead in raw firepower. A direct defense of Earth was not a war, it was a delay. A costly, painful, necessary delay. What happened during that delay was what mattered. While the Coalition fleet approached and Earth's remaining military forces prepared to fight and die buying time, a separate operation was already underway. Ships, not warships, but transports, cargo haulers, medical vessels, old colony craft that had been quietly refitted, were moving people. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. Enough genetic diversity, Enough engineers, enough doctors and farmers and teachers and soldiers, enough of the human archive to carry the species forward into somewhere the Coalition would never think to look. They went into uncharted systems. They went dark the moment they cleared the edge of known Coalition territory. No transmissions, no navigation beacons, no trade with anyone. They became, for all practical purposes, nothing. And in that nothing, they went to work. The first years were the hardest. There were 11 scattered settlements across 4 separate systems, each one isolated from the others by design, each one running its own version of the same desperate project. They called it the Reclamation. Not the recovery, not the survival plan, not the exile. The Reclamation, because the word had a direction built into it. It meant they were going back. The settlements did not have enough of anything. Not enough food in the early seasons, not enough medicine in the early winters, not enough materials to build what they needed at the speed they needed it. People died in those first years from things that should not have been fatal, from infections, from accidents, from the kind of slow despair that takes hold when a person looks at the life they have built and cannot yet see the shape of the future it is pointing toward. But they kept building. Donald Rusk was 26 years old when the first settlement on the planet they called Holdfast began to take shape around him. He was not a leader. He was not a soldier. He was an engineer who had been recruited in the final months before the evacuation because of a thesis he had written about emission masking in deep space environments, a theoretical paper that his university had graded AB+ and mostly ignored. Someone in the secret planning committee had read it, understood what it was actually saying beneath the technical language, and put his name on a list. Rusk spent his first 8 years on Holdfast building infrastructure, water reclamation, power generation, agricultural systems that could survive the planet's long, cold growing season. He did not think about stealth drives during those years. He thought about whether the soil chemistry would support legumes and whether the pipe joints would hold through winter expansion. He was good at thinking about immediate problems. That was how he survived. The stealth drive came later, and it came from a problem rather than an idea. The problem was simple. If you built warships and flew them back to Earth, the Coalition would see you coming from 40 light minutes away and have time to prepare. You could not fight your way through what was between you and home if they knew you were coming. You had to arrive already there. Rusk had been thinking about this problem for years in the background of his mind. The way certain problems live in you without demanding your full attention, just sitting there turning slowly like something warming up. He knew the theory. Emission masking was well understood. The issue was scale. You could mask one ship. You could, with great difficulty, mask a small group of ships. But a fleet? 1,400 vessels, each generating their own heat, their own gravitational signature, their own interference patterns? The math said it could not be done. Rusk spent 3 years trying to prove the math wrong. He failed twice. The first failure was a technical one. The masking field he designed would work until a ship moved faster than a certain threshold, at which point the emission scatter pattern would collapse and the vessel would light up on any sensor in range like a flare. The second failure was worse. He had solved the movement problem, but the power draw required to run the masking system across a large formation was greater than any drive system they could sustain. He had built a machine that worked perfectly and could not be fueled. He did not quit. This is the important thing. He did not quit, and he did not slow down, and when people asked him how the drive project was going, he said it was going and he meant it, even in the years when it clearly was not. The solution, when it finally came, was not what he expected. It was not a new engine or a new field design. It was a new understanding of what the masking system was actually doing. He had been thinking of it as a shield, something that blocked signals from going out. But the reason individual ship masking worked was not because it blocked signals. It was because it rebroadcast them, subtly altered, in patterns that read as background radiation. The ship did not become invisible. It became boring. It became something as sensor operators I slid over without registering. At fleet scale, the trick was not to mask each ship individually. It was to make the entire formation behave like one large, uninteresting section of deep space. Like a region of slightly elevated background noise. Something any sensor would log and dismiss. It took him another 4 years to engineer that. By the time the system worked, he was 41 years old, and he had not slept more than 5 hours in a row for the better part of a decade. He submitted his results to the Reclamation Engineering Council in a document that was 17 pages long and written in language so dry and technical that the council member who first read it did not immediately understand what she was looking at. Then she read it again. Then she called an emergency session. Across the 4 settlement systems, the shipyards that had been building slowly, carefully, under total communication blackout, shifted into their final phase. The drives were installed. The systems were tested, vessel by vessel, in deep space with observer ships placed at distances matching the expected position of coalition sensors. The observer ships reported nothing. Even knowing what to look for, even knowing the exact coordinates of the test vessels, they saw only background space. Hara Solden was a lieutenant commander when the stealth drive was confirmed to work. She was an admiral by the time the last of the 1,400 ships completed its shakedown. She had been chosen for the command for one reason above all others. She was the best in the fleet at waiting. Every officer who had served under her said the same thing about her. She never rushed. She never let impatience make decisions for her. She could hold a course and hold a position and hold her people together across time in a way that no one could fully explain and everyone could feel. She had been chosen to bring the fleet home. She had accepted without hesitation and without ceremony. On the day they departed the settlement systems for the last time, she did not give a speech. She did not mark the occasion. She sat in her command chair, checked the stealth drive status across all 1,400 ships, confirmed that every vessel read clean to every sensor they could test it against, and then simply said, "Move out." They moved into the dark and disappeared. Somewhere in coalition space, in a small and deliberately forgettable diplomatic office attached to a trading station near the border, Ambassador Karel Issa of the Mirani reviewed his notes one final time and then deleted them. He had been feeding humanity patrol schedules, sensor net positions, and coalition fleet rotation data for 11 years. He was done now. They did not need his information anymore. They had everything they needed. He sat for a moment in the quiet office and thought about the humans he had met during those 11 years. The ones who had come to him carefully, indirectly, through layers of cover stories and false identities, to collect the data he had gathered. He thought about how calm they had always been, how patient, how completely devoid of the frantic energy you might expect from a species trying to claw its way back from extinction. They had not seemed desperate. They had seemed certain. He had found that remarkable then. He found it more remarkable now. Somewhere beyond the edge of known coalition space, 1,400 ships running dark were crossing into the solar system, and the 5 captains orbiting Earth were laughing into an empty channel, and the silence they thought they owned was already full of something they had no name for. The fleet was inside the outer system now, still cold, still invisible, still moving. They had been moving for 30 years. A few more hours would not change anything. Tension is a strange thing. It does not announce itself. It arrives slowly, the way pressure builds in a sealed room, not felt in any single breath, but present in all of them, until the moment you realize your shoulders have been raised for an hour and you do not know when they went up. Drev Ashen had been talking for a long time. This was not unusual. Ashen was a being who filled silence the way water fills a low place, automatically, without decision, because that was simply what he did. He had exhausted his memories of the siege, revisited them from several angles, and was now deep into a story about a junior officer on his crew during the original campaign who had apparently been so excited by the bombardment that he had forgotten to log his weapon's discharge for 3 consecutive shifts. The story was not interesting. Ashen told it with great enthusiasm. Baro INDT had stopped listening sometime during the second retelling. He was reviewing cargo manifests for the return leg of the patrol, which was a more productive use of his attention. His ship needed 3 replacement coolant relays and a full resupply of hull sealant. He had noted these requirements in the appropriate form and submitted it to the supply depot at their next stop. This was the kind of work INDT liked. Clear requirements, clear solutions, no ambiguity. Grailtoss sat at his command chair and looked at Earth. He had not said much since the broadcast started. He had laughed at the right moments and agreed at the right moments, and that was sufficient for the occasion. No one expected a young captain to dominate a conversation where 2 senior captains were already competing for the most air. He was content to be present and quiet, and to keep the thing in his chest pressed down where it could not be seen. The thing in his chest was not guilt. He did not know what to call it. It was a kind of unease, a low and persistent discomfort, like a sound at the edge of hearing that you cannot quite locate. He had felt it since they arrived at Earth. He had assumed it would pass once he was back in familiar space. It had not passed. He looked at the planet below and tried to understand what bothered him about it. Earth was dead. Everyone said so. Everyone knew so. The records were clear. The sensor data was unambiguous. The Coalition's post-campaign surveys had confirmed no intelligent life signatures in the entire system. No signals, no structures, no thermal signatures consistent with organized habitation. Nothing. The planet was a ruin with weather. So why did looking at it feel like being watched? He dismissed the thought. It was nothing. It was fatigue and the strange atmosphere of the occasion. Being here, in this place, at this anniversary. Sentiment made people imagine things. He looked away from the viewport and back at his duty roster. Sorlamine was not looking at the planet. She was looking at her long-range sensor display, which was showing her exactly what it had been showing her for the past 2 hours. Nothing. Clean, flat, unremarkable deep space in every direction. The outer system was clear. The asteroid belt was behaving normally. The gas giant beyond it was generating its usual interference patterns, well within expected parameters. The region between the outer system and their current position was empty space, as it should be. She ran the gravitational background reading again. It came back normal. She stared at it for a moment. She had been running this check every 20 minutes for the past 2 hours because of a reading she had seen once that she could not reproduce. It had been a smoothness, an evenness to the background gravity that had not matched the expected variation for this region. She had noted it. She had checked it. She had found nothing to support it. And yet, Ashen, she said, cutting into his story at a point she judged was not important. Have your sensors run a full gravitational background sweep of the outer system in the past hour? A brief pause. My sensors have not flagged anything. I know. I am asking if they ran a full sweep. Another pause, longer this time, carrying the slight edge of irritation that Ashen wore whenever he was pulled away from something he was enjoying. They run automatic sweeps on standard interval. Nothing has been flagged. If there were something to flag, it would be flagged. That is what the automatic sweep is for. Min looked at her display again. I had an anomalous reading 2 hours ago. I cannot reproduce it. Then it was not anomalous, NDT said, without looking up from his manifests. It was an error. I ran it 3 times. Then it was 3 errors. Min did not respond to that. She was aware that she had no evidence. She was aware that nothing on her display supported concern. She was aware that 2 senior captains and 1 who ranked above her had no interest in her uncertainty, and that pressing the matter without evidence would mark her as nervous and imprecise. In Coalition command culture, nervous and imprecise were not qualities that advanced your position. She noted the reading in her personal log, which no one would look at unless something went wrong. Then she set her sensors to a shorter sweep interval and went back to watching. On the Terran flagship, running dark, running cold, 40,000 kilometers behind the Coalition formation, and reading as nothing at all on every sensor Min owned, Hara Solden was walking. She did this sometimes before an action. Not pacing. Walking. There was a difference. Pacing was agitated movement that covered no ground. Walking was deliberate, 1 foot in front of the other, a direction and a pace maintained. She walked the length of the bridge from the command station to the forward viewport and back, slowly, hands behind her back, eyes forward. The crew did not speak to her during this. They knew the walk. They had seen it before smaller actions, before difficult navigational passages, before the moment 3 years ago when she had ordered the entire fleet to reduce power output by 30% and hold position for 11 days while a Coalition patrol swept through the outer system without detecting them. The walk meant she was thinking through final variables. It meant the decision was already made, and she was simply satisfying herself that nothing had been missed. Commander Sarah Vane was at the tactical station. She was watching everything at once. The Coalition formation, the stealth integrity readings across all 1,400 ships, the approach vectors, the distance markers ticking down with every quiet kilometer the fleet covered. She had not spoken in 40 minutes. She did not need to speak. Everything she needed to know was on the display in front of her, and everything she needed to do was already in motion. Solden reached the forward viewport and stopped. She looked at Earth below, or rather, at the curved edge of space where Earth sat at the center of everything that was about to happen. She had not seen it in 30 years. From this angle and distance, through the dark of the viewport, it looked the same as she remembered from the last time she had seen it, blue and white, and impossibly fragile, looking for something that had survived as long as it had. She had been 22 when she left. She was 52 now. The arithmetic of that sat in her chest in a way she had long since learned to carry without letting it bend her posture. Vane spoke. Rusk confirmed stealth integrity across all 1,400 ships. We are reading clean. Solden turned from the viewport. Distance: 41,000 kilometers. Within engagement range on your order. Solden walked back to her command chair. She sat. She looked at the 5 coalition ships on the display, drifting, relaxed, broadcasting into empty space, entirely unaware that the empty space behind them had a population of 12,000 human beings and 1,400 warships. She had thought about this moment many times over the years. She had expected to feel something large when it arrived. Rage, perhaps, or grief, or some bright hard thing that finally released after 30 years of pressure. She did not feel any of those things. What she felt was very simple and very clean, like a mechanism clicking into its final position after a long assembly. She reached out and pressed the ship-wide channel. This is Admiral Solden. All ships, bring drives to full power. All weapons to active. Shields up. Hold formation. Do not fire until my order. She closed the channel. Then she looked at Vane. Begin. In the span of 4 seconds, 4 seconds across the entire formation, with the synchronization of a system that had been tested and retested for 3 years, 1,400 human warships came alive from absolute cold. Their drives engaged. Their weapon systems powered. Their shields came up. Their sensor signatures went from nothing to enormous in the time it takes a heart to beat 4 times. On Sorla Mean's display, the outer system went from empty space to catastrophically full. She did not scream. She was not the kind of being who screamed. But her hands stopped moving and her breath stopped in her body for a moment that felt much longer than it was, because her mind was trying to reconcile what she was seeing with the category of things that were possible. 1,400 contacts. Bearing 0. Range 41,000 kilometers. Already locked. They were already locked. She had run 30 sensor sweeps in the past 2 hours and seen nothing. And they had been there. Behind her, around her, in the space she had checked and rechecked and declared clean. They had been there the entire time. Ashen's story about his junior officer cut off mid-sentence. INDT's cargo manifest slid off his display, forgotten. Toss looked up from his duty roster and saw the tactical display, and the thing in his chest that he had been pressing down for 2 hours finally pressed back. The open broadcast channel, still running, still cast wide into the void, picked up the sound of every alarm on 5 coalition warships firing simultaneously. On the Terran flagship, Hara Solden heard it too. She had been waiting for it. The thing about a demonstration is that it only works if the other side survives long enough to understand what they just witnessed. Solden had planned for this. Everything in the next 60 seconds had been planned for, rehearsed, argued over in tactical meetings across 3 years and 4 systems. She knew what she was going to say and when she was going to say it. She knew which ships would move and where they would move. She knew the order in which things would happen and the order in which she needed her officers to respond. What she had not planned for, because it was not the kind of thing that fit into a plan, was the sound of Drev Ashen's voice the first time he saw the fleet. It was not a word. It was not a sentence. It was a sound that came across the still open broadcast channel, a short and involuntary sound. The kind a being makes when something they have understood to be impossible reveals itself as simply something they did not expect. It was very small, and it lasted only a fraction of a second, and then it was buried under alarms and shouted orders and the frantic noise of a crew going from ceremonial orbit to battle stations in 0 warning. But Solden heard it, and she set it aside and opened her own channel. Her voice, when it came across the coalition frequencies, was calm. Not the calm of a person suppressing something, but the calm of a person who has already processed every stage of grief and come out the other side of it into something very clear and very stable. She spoke in Coalition Standard, which she had spent years studying, because she wanted to be understood precisely and without interpretation. This is Admiral Harasol Den of the Terran Reclamation Fleet. You are surrounded. Your current position has been covered by 1,400 armed vessels since before you arrived in this system. You have not detected us because we did not choose to be detected. You are now choosing to be detected because we are choosing it. I am transmitting a full sensor record of the past 11 days as proof of this. She paused for exactly 2 seconds. You have 60 seconds to transmit an unconditional acknowledgement of human sovereignty over Earth and all Sol system bodies. If you do this, your ships will be boarded, your weapons will be disabled, and you will be returned to Coalition space unharmed. If you do not do this, I will give the order to engage. I will not give this offer twice. She closed the transmission. On the 5 Coalition ships, 60 seconds had different meanings for different captains. Barrow INDT spent the first 10 seconds doing what he always did when faced with a problem. He looked for a solution that his firepower could deliver. His heavy cruiser was the most powerful ship in the Coalition formation. Its main cannon could, under the right conditions, take out a vessel 3 times its size in a single sustained discharge. He ordered it charged. His weapons officer complied and then reported a problem. Targeting resolution was compromised. There were too many contacts, too close, and too many overlapping firing arcs. The system was trying to prioritize and could not. Every time it locked onto one ship, 17 more filled the space around it. The cannon took 40 seconds to reach full charge. By the time it was ready, his targeting officer had a solution. A firing solution aimed at the human flagship, identifiable by its position at the center of the formation. 41,000 kilometers. It was a long shot, but not impossible for a weapon of this class. He never gave the order to fire. He got one more second of thinking it over before the second thing happened. Grail Toss broke formation. Toss had not decided to break formation in any conscious way. His hands had moved to the navigation controls and input a hard turn before the decision had completed its journey from his instincts to his awareness. He was not running. He told himself he was not running. He was maneuvering. He was creating distance and angle. He was positioning for a tactical response. He was running. 3 human vessels peeled off the outer formation and matched his course exactly, staying behind him at a distance of 2,000 kilometers. They did not fire. They did not hail him. They simply followed, with the patient and unhurried attention of beings who had already decided where this was going and were simply going to be there when it arrived. Toss held his heading for 4 seconds and then felt the futility of it the way you feel the floor when you stop expecting it to hold you. He cut thrust. He held position. His ship drifted. The 3 human vessels held position behind him. Olavreth had not moved and had not attempted to charge a weapon. She had spent her 60 seconds doing something that no one else in the formation was doing. She was looking at the sensor data. She was reading the actual numbers, the count of contacts, the distribution of mass signatures, the engine output levels of the human fleet. She was doing the mathematics of what she was seeing. She was not a being who fooled herself. It was a point of personal pride that had served her for 20 years of command. When the numbers were bad, she saw the numbers as bad. She did not soften them or reframe them or find reasons they might be better than they looked. The numbers were catastrophic. She ran them twice. They did not improve. Then she looked at the time counter on her display. 42 seconds remained. Vreth had built her life on a series of loyalties, to her crew, to her commander, to the Coalition, to the idea that certain things were worth dying for and that she had the judgment to tell the difference. She had always assumed that if the moment came, she would know. She would know clearly and immediately what the thing worth dying for was, and she would die for it without hesitation, because that was who she was. The moment was here. She looked at it directly. She found that the loyalties did not stack the way she expected. Her loyalty to her crew sat at the bottom of the structure, and everything else sat on top of it. And when she tested the weight of the structure against the reality of the tactical display, she found that she did not want to press the self-destruct code. She wanted her crew to survive. She wanted them to go home. But she also could not surrender. This was not pride. This was something older than pride, something that had been built into her so long ago, she could not locate where it had come from. She could not transmit that acknowledgement. She could not say, in formal coalition standard, that this planet belonged to humans. Her hands would not form the words. Vreth looked at the time counter. 18 seconds. She pressed the self-destruct authorization code. sealed it with her command signature, and gave her crew exactly 10 seconds of warning. She did not explain. She did not apologize. She told them she was sorry, and she meant it, and she authorized the sequence. The explosion was visible from Earth's surface, if there had been anyone on Earth's surface to see it. Sorlamin had known what she was going to do before Solden finished speaking. She had known it the moment her sensor display had filled with 1,400 contacts that had been invisible 2 seconds earlier. She had known it the way she had known, 2 hours ago, that something was wrong in the gravitational background, not from evidence, but from the part of her mind that processed patterns before she could articulate them. The pattern here was clear. The conclusion was clear. The action required was clear. With 4 seconds left on the counter, Min transmitted her acknowledgement. Full and unconditional. In clean coalition standard. The channel registered her compliance. One of the 1,400 human ships shifted its weapons lock off her vessel. Not all of them. Some of them stayed locked. She did not find this unreasonable. Then the counter ran out. Ashen had spent his 59 seconds talking. He had used the open channel the way he always used it. As a platform, as a stage. And he had issued threats, demanded proof, questioned the legality of the blockade, referenced 3 separate coalition treaties that he claimed made this action a violation of interstellar law, and then, when none of that achieved anything, he had said several things about humans in general and Hara Solden in particular that would later be included in the sensor record transmitted to every communication network in the galaxy. He had not believed, in those 59 seconds, that she would actually give the order. He had believed this because he had believed, in the way comfortable beings believe things, that the size and importance of the coalition made certain outcomes impossible. The coalition was vast. The coalition had been the dominant power structure in this region of the galaxy for 400 years. A species that the coalition had defeated and declared extinct 30 years ago could not simply reappear with a fleet of 1,400 ships and start issuing terms. It was not possible. Therefore, it was not happening. Therefore, if he talked long enough and confidently enough, the situation would resolve itself into something that fit his understanding of how the galaxy worked. At 60 seconds, Solden gave the order to engage. 47 human ships fired simultaneously on Ashen's vessel, not to destroy it, but to cripple it. Hull systems, drive systems, weapon systems. Precise, planned, surgical. The targeting had been worked out in advance. His ship's shields lasted 9 seconds before failing. His weapons never fully charged before they were knocked offline. His drive was gone in the first 4 seconds of the engagement, and after that his ship was simply a very large and very expensive piece of wreckage drifting in orbit above Earth. Barrow INDT got his main cannon charged and got his targeting solution and held it for 2 full seconds while he decided whether to take the shot at the flagship. Then the ship on his port side fired a precision burst into the barrel housing of the cannon itself, which was not a shot that many weapons officers had the skill or the nerve to attempt, and the cannon was gone. Then his shields. Then his engines. Then his entire weapons grid, one system at a time, with the methodical patience of a technician going through a checklist. He sat in his command chair for 3 minutes after his ship was fully disabled, in the dark, listening to his crew doing damage assessment, before he admitted to himself what had just happened. Then he sat for 2 more minutes in silence. The boarding teams reached Ashen's ship first. The Terran soldiers cut through the bridge access in a way that suggested they had done it before, not this specific hull, but the class of ship, the type of hatch, the layout of the access corridor. They came through in practiced formation, and they were very professional about it, and Ashen shouted at them the entire time, which did not change what happened. He was removed from his own bridge against his stated wishes and carried to a transport shuttle, which delivered him to the Terran flagship. He was given medical attention he did not want and restraints he could not refuse. The doctor who treated his head wound, sustained when an explosion on the bridge had thrown him against a console, worked efficiently and without hostility and without any interest in his opinions. Toss, still holding position 2,000 kilometers ahead of the 3 human ships that had followed him, received a simple hail. One human officer, professional and brief, explaining that they could do this the easy way or the other way, and that the easy way had a door that was still open. Toss opened the door. The battle, if you could call it that, lasted 11 minutes. One ship self-destroyed. 3 were disabled without significant casualties. 1 surrendered early and avoided engagement entirely. 1 was boarded. 1,400 human ships held formation through all of it. Not one of them had broken discipline. Not one had fired an unauthorized shot. Not one crew member had done anything other than exactly what Solden had ordered, in exactly the way she had ordered it. Below them, Earth turned. It had been turning the whole time. Rain was falling on the eastern coast of what had been, 30 years ago, a city of 4 million people. Solden did not know that yet. She was still in orbit. The 4 surviving captains were aboard the flagship. Min had been placed in a comfortable but supervised set of quarters. Not a cell, but not a place she could leave without escort. Toss was in a similar arrangement 1 corridor away and had not spoken since boarding. INDT was in the medical bay with 2 fractured ribs and a bruised expression that had more to do with his situation than his injuries. Ashen was in a room that was slightly more secure than the others, because Ashen had demonstrated a persistent willingness to argue with every person who entered, and it had been judged more practical to give him fewer people to argue with. Solden dealt with Min first, because Min was the variable she had not planned for as precisely as the others. She went to Min's quarters alone. She did not bring guards, which Min noted. She sat down across from the Thurvi captain in a plain chair with no ceremony, and she looked at Min for a moment without speaking. Min looked back at her. She had done nothing in the hours since boarding except sit and think and examine what she was feeling, which was a complicated process she was not yet finished with. You stood down with 4 seconds remaining, Solden said. Yes. I want to understand why. Min considered this. Not the question, the answer. She knew the answer. She was deciding how honest to be with it. She decided to be entirely honest, because she had the distinct impression that this particular human would find anything less entirely transparent and would simply wait for the real answer. I ran the numbers, Min said. The mathematics of the situation were clear. I do not believe in dying for conclusions that mathematics has already settled. Solden nodded. It was not the nod of someone satisfied or grateful. It was the nod of someone who has confirmed a data point. You also noticed something 2 hours before the engagement, Solden said. A gravitational anomaly in the outer system. Min went very still. We recorded your sensor sweeps, Solden said, without particular emphasis. We were interested in whether the masking would survive a focused investigation. It survived yours, but your instinct was correct. You were right to look. Min said, after a pause. The other 4 did not believe me. No. There was a silence. You are not going to thank me, Min said, for standing down. No, Solden said. You stood down because it was the rational choice under the circumstances. I do not thank beings for choosing rationally when the alternative was my people's deaths, but I recognize it, and it will be reflected in how you are treated. Min nodded once. That was an exchange she could work with. She was a practical being. She would take it. Ashen was last. He had, by the time Solden arrived, been in his room for 6 hours. The doctor had treated him and left. The guard outside had not spoken to him. He had been given food, which he had eaten because he was hungry, and refusing it would not have made any point he was interested in making. He had composed, in his head, a formal protest under 7 different sections of Coalition interstellar law. He had decided which section he would lead with. He had been waiting for someone to deliver it to. Solden came through the door, and he began. She let him go for approximately 45 seconds. He covered the illegality of the blockade, the violation of coalition sovereignty, the proper protocols for engagement that had not been followed, and had just started in on the relevant treaty citations when she spoke over him without raising her voice. Ashen. He stopped, less because she asked him to and more because something in the way she said his name suggested that the next part was going to be more important than the treaty citations. She had a display pad in her hand. She set it on the table between them and played a recording. It was a sensor log, time stamped from 11 hours earlier, from the vantage point of a stealth ship positioned 2,000 kilometers behind the coalition formation. The recording showed the 5 coalition ships in close formation above Earth. It showed Ashen's ship at the center of the formation, at the center of the frame. It showed the open broadcast channel indicator running along the bottom of the display. And behind the 5 ships, behind them, visible in the sensor record, clear and present and enormous, It showed the leading edge of the Terran fleet. 1,400 ships, silent and dark, arranged in the space between the Coalition formation and deep space. The recording played Ashen's voice, his own voice, coming across the open channel that his ship had been broadcasting on, talking about the smell of Earth's atmosphere during the bombardment, talking about victory, talking about how humanity was gone and the silence was permanent. His voice, while 1,200 human warships drifted behind his ship. Solden let the recording finish. Then she turned it off. Ashen looked at the display pad for a long time. His expression was not readable to most beings, but Solden had spent years studying Coalition species physiognomy for exactly this kind of work, and what she read on his face was not rage and not defiance. It was the look of a being whose understanding of recent events has been revised in a fundamental way and who has not yet worked out what to do with the revision. "You were there," he said, "when I was talking." "The whole fleet was there," Solden said. "We were there when you arrived. We were there for the entire broadcast. You were speaking into a space full of the species you were eulogizing, and we were listening, and we chose when to be heard." Ashen said nothing. "Humanity should have stayed dead," he said, eventually. It was not the protest he had been preparing. It was something that came from somewhere lower, something that had been sitting underneath the citations and the protocol arguments, the actual thing he felt. "We were never dead," Solden said. "You closed a file. Files are not graves." He had nothing to say to that either. She left him there and went to prepare for the next part. The shuttle that carried Solden down to Earth's surface was a standard personnel transport, nothing remarkable, flown by a pilot who had been born on Holdfast and had never seen Earth until today. The pilot did not say anything during the descent. Neither did Solden. They watched the cloud layer approach through the viewport, and then the shuttle was inside the clouds, and then they were below them, and there was the surface. It was raining. A steady, gray, unhurried rain, the kind that had been falling over this particular part of the coast for probably the last 2 days and would go on falling for 2 or 3 more before it finished. The shuttle set down in what had been, from the aerial survey, a broad open plaza at the center of a coastal city. The plaza was partially overgrown. Grass and low shrubs had pushed up through the old paving stones. Along the edges of it, buildings stood in various states of ruin. Some collapsed, some standing but gutted, some still largely intact with 30 years of weather working on them. Solden walked down the shuttle ramp and stood on the paving stones and felt the rain on her face. She was 52 years old, and she had left this planet at 22, and in between those two facts there was an entire human life of exile and work and purpose and loss, and standing here in the rain at the center of it, she could not immediately organize it into anything she could speak. So she did not speak. She stood in the rain and looked at the city around her, the ruined city, the reclaiming city, the city that the planet was slowly, patiently absorbing back into itself, and she let the rain fall on her. She heard the second shuttle land behind her. She heard Sarah Vane walk down the ramp and across the paving stones and come to stand beside her. Vane did not speak either. She stood at Solden's left, at the same angle and the same posture, and looked at the same city. They stood there for several minutes. The broadcast was running. The cameras on the shuttle were transmitting live to every human colony and settlement, to every ship in the fleet, to Holdfast and New Formosa and Reach's End and Faro Station, to every place where human beings had been living in exile for 30 years waiting for this specific image to arrive. It was not a speech. It was not a ceremony. It was 2 humans standing on Earth in the rain. In the settlement halls and the mess decks and the dormitories and the farm stations across 4 systems, people stopped what they were doing and watched the broadcast. Some of them cried. Many of them did not, because there are feelings too large for crying, and this was one of them. They watched the 2 figures standing on the paving stones with the rain coming down around them and the ruined city behind them, and they understood what they were seeing in a way that did not require explanation. Vane spoke eventually. Her voice was quiet and not intended for the broadcast, though the broadcast picked it up. "Is it what you remembered?" Solden looked at the buildings, at the overgrowth, at the way the rain was making small rivers between the paving stones, tracing paths through the moss and the grass. "No," she said. "It is better." Vane looked at her. "Because it is still here," Solden said. She did not explain further. She did not need to. Vane understood, and the broadcast went out to the colonies, and the rain kept falling on Earth, and the planet turned the way it had always turned, slowly, without asking permission, without stopping for any siege or any silence or any beings who had mistaken its patience for defeat. It had simply been waiting, the way old things wait, for the weight on it to shift. Now it had shifted. Now something could begin. News travels at the speed of whoever is most alarmed by it. The Galactic Dominion Coalition's internal communication network was, under ordinary circumstances, a dignified and methodical system. Reports were filed. Reports were reviewed. Reports were passed upward through the appropriate chain of authority at the appropriate pace, with the appropriate level of language reserved for the appropriate level of event. The system had been designed over 400 years to prevent panic from moving faster than considered response. It took the news from the Sol system approximately 9 hours to completely overwhelm that system. The initial report was flagged as a routine anomaly, an automated distress signal from a coalition patrol in a decommissioned sector, significance unclear, follow-up assigned to a mid-level logistics office. The logistics office opened the file, saw the first line of the sensor data attached, and immediately sent the file upward with an urgency classification it had never used before. The file arrived at the strategic command level in under an hour, which was not how the system was designed to work. Strategic Command reviewed the sensor logs. They reviewed them twice. Then they called an emergency session that was supposed to involve 12 senior officials and ended up involving 31, because everyone who was told not to attend came anyway. The logs showed 1,400 ships that no detection system in Coalition space had ever recorded. Ships that had been moving through surveilled space for 11 days without appearing on a single sensor net. Ships that had been built, clearly, over a significant period of time. Their construction quality, their weapon systems, their drive signatures all indicated a shipbuilding program of enormous scale and sophistication. A program that had been conducted in complete secrecy by a species the Coalition's own records officially listed as extinct. Strategic Command did not panic. It was made up of experienced beings who had managed crises for decades, and panicking was not something any of them would do in front of the others. What they did instead was sit in a very quiet room for a very long time and think through the implications of what they were looking at. The implications were significant. The first and most obvious implication was that the Coalition's intelligence apparatus had failed completely and undetectably for 30 years. Humanity had been building ships, developing technology, maintaining organized civilization, and preparing a military campaign at fleet scale, and no one had known. No informant, no patrol, no stray signal, no trace, nothing. A failure of this scale did not have a precedent in Coalition history, and it did not have an easy explanation, which meant it did not have an easy solution, which meant the next species that decided to do something similar might also succeed, and that was a thought that made the room very uncomfortable. The second implication was the technology itself. The stealth drive system, whatever it was, however it functioned, did not match anything in the Coalition's engineering database. It was not an incremental improvement on known masking systems. It was something different in kind, not in degree, which meant that humanity had, in 30 years of exile and deprivation, developed a technology the Coalition had not developed in 400 years of organized research. That also made the room uncomfortable. The third implication was harder to articulate, but harder to ignore. 1,400 ships, 5 Coalition warships, 1 engagement, 11 minutes. The outcome had not been close. The Coalition captains had not managed to fire a single effective shot at the human fleet. They had been disabled, captured, and presented with terms before they had fully processed what was happening. And this was not because the humans had superior firepower in the raw sense. The numbers suggested comparable weapon yields. It was because the humans had chosen the time, the place, the approach, the formation, and the first moment of visibility with such precision that the 5 Coalition ships had never had a meaningful decision to make. The engagement had been over before it began, not because of what happened in those 11 minutes, but because of what had been arranged in the 30 years before them. This made the room deeply uncomfortable, and no one said so directly, because saying so directly would require them to also say what it implied about the Coalition's position relative to a species they had spent 30 years believing was extinct. The meeting concluded with a classified resolution and a list of 14 action items. The resolution and the list were not made public. What was made public, what could not be contained or framed or absorbed into the ordinary communication system, was the sensor log, the full log, including the audio of the 5 captains broadcast over Earth, paired with the visual record showing the human fleet that had been listening to every word of it. The Terran Reclamation Authority had released this log themselves, simultaneously, to every open communication network in the known galaxy. Not to the Coalition directly, not through diplomatic channels, directly to the public frequencies, to the news aggregators, to the civilian networks, to the science and academic channels, to the trade and commerce broadcasts, to everyone. It spread the way things spread when they are both important and impossible to stop, not as a story, not as a report, but as raw data that anyone could look at and draw their own conclusions from. And the conclusions that beings drew, across dozens of species and hundreds of star systems, were broadly similar. They heard Ashen's voice. They heard him laughing. They saw, in the sensor record, what was behind him. Some species found it funny, in the way that things are funny when the arrogance being punctured belongs to someone else. Some found it sobering. Some found it alarming in a way that had nothing to do with sympathy for the Coalition. Alarmed at what humans had been doing in silence, at what humans were now capable of, at what humans had demonstrated about patience and restraint as weapons. Some species, quietly and without announcement, began reviewing their own historical conduct toward humanity. Several of these reviews resulted in private communications sent through non-coalition diplomatic channels to the Terran Reclamation Authority. These communications were politely worded and carefully non-committal, and each one of them was, in essence, a question. Are we going to have a problem? The Terran Reclamation Authority replied to each one in the same way. Politely, directly. No, they said, if you did not participate in what happened to Earth. No, if you do not choose to participate in anything like it again. The communications were brief. They did not elaborate. They did not make threats. They did not make promises that went beyond what was stated. The replies were, in their restraint, more frightening than threats would have been. Several species that had been coalition-aligned for decades began reconsidering the terms of that alignment. In the coalition's diplomatic wing, Ambassador Karel Issa of the Mirani publicly submitted a formal statement disclosing the full nature and duration of his cooperation with humanity. He did this calmly, on the record, in front of coalition cameras, and he answered every question asked of him with complete transparency. Yes, he had provided patrol schedules. Yes, he had provided sensor net positions. Yes, he had done this for 11 years, beginning 7 years after the siege of Earth, when he had concluded that the coalition's account of the campaign contained significant inaccuracies and that the silence from the Sol system was not what it appeared to be. He was censured. The censure was formal and recorded, and the Mirani government received a strongly worded diplomatic note. The Mirani government acknowledged the note and filed it. Their trade agreements with coalition member species were too extensive and too economically significant to allow the censure to carry further consequences, and everyone involved was aware of this, which made the censure feel somewhat hollow to the beings who had drafted it. Issa sat in his office after the formal hearing and allowed himself a cup of something warm and looked out at the station's view of deep space and thought about nothing in particular for a while. He was tired in the pleasant way of a person who has finished a very long job and is not yet sure what to do with the absence of it. Donald Rusk was not tired. Rusk was back at work. He had not attended the formal celebrations at any of the settlement colonies. He had acknowledged, briefly, a message from the Terran Reclamation Authority congratulating him on the success of the stealth drive system, and he had replied to it with a single line noting that the system's performance had confirmed his theoretical model and that several refinements were already apparent from the field data. He was not being cold. He was being accurate. The field data was genuinely interesting, and he did not want to lose time. He was now working on a problem he had identified during the approach to the Sol system. A slight instability in the masking field at specific relativistic velocities that had not appeared in the controlled tests. It had not affected the mission. It would need to be corrected anyway. He worked in the evenings and on weekends with the focused attention of a person who finds the work more restful than the rest. The 4 surviving captains were returned to Coalition space 6 weeks after the engagement. following a formal process that the Terran Reclamation Authority called a hearing and the Coalition's legal office called something much more complicated. No charges were filed. No punishments were imposed. This was a deliberate decision on humanity's part. They did not want prisoners, and they did not want a legal proceeding that the Coalition could contest or politicize. What they wanted was the record. The sensor logs, the broadcast audio, the tactical data from the 11-minute engagement. All of it was compiled into a single public archive and distributed permanently to every open database and academic institution that requested it. The request form required no credentials. Anyone could ask for it and receive it. It was, by design, impossible to suppress. Sorla Mean returned to Coalition space and, 48 hours after arrival, submitted her resignation from the Coalition Naval Service. She did this without explanation, though she was asked for one by 3 separate officials and ignored all 3. She retired to a small property on a largely agricultural world near the Coalition's outer territories and spent the following months doing very little. A journalist found her eventually, as journalists do, and asked her for a statement about the engagement. She gave one. She had not intended to, but the journalist asked the right question, which was not what had she thought when she first saw the fleet on her sensors, but what did she think it meant? Mean thought about it for a moment. We looked at a silent planet and called it a grave, she said. We were wrong. It was a hell breath. She declined to answer any further questions, and the journalist, to their credit, printed what she had said without adding anything to it. On Earth, a settlement went up. It was not impressive. It was a collection of prefabricated structures on a cleared section of the coastal plain, modest and functional, with a water reclamation system and a small agricultural plot and a communications tower that was the tallest thing for 20 kilometers. It housed, at first, 230 people. More were coming. They were always coming now, in the slow and steady way of people who are moving towards something rather than away from it. Hara Solden stepped down from the Admiralty on the day the settlement was formally registered and named. She handed command to Sarah Vane, who accepted it with the quiet competence she brought to everything. There was no ceremony. They shook hands. Solden walked off the flagship for the last time and took a shuttle down to Earth and did not go back to space. She built a house. It took 3 months. She built it herself, with help from 2 of the settlement's construction teams, on a low rise above the coastal plain where the old city had been. From the house, she could see the water in one direction and the edge of the growing settlement in the other. In between was a stretch of reclaimed grassland, green and ordinary and beautiful in the way that ordinary things are beautiful when you have been away from them long enough. She lived quietly. She grew a small garden. She learned the habits of the local weather, which was different from anything she had known in 30 years of colony life. Warmer in some seasons, stranger in the rain, with winds off the water that smelled like something she could not name but recognized at a level deeper than memory. She wrote nothing down about the campaign. She gave no interviews. She refused every request for a formal account of the engagement, every invitation to speak at commemorations, every offer to have her name attached to things. She was not modest about it. She simply felt that everything that needed to be said had been said in the sensor logs, and that everything that needed to be done was being done by the people doing it, and that her part was finished. The settlement grew. Others started. Earth was not healed. It would not be healed in Solden's lifetime or her children's lifetimes, if she had children, which she had not yet decided about. But it was being worked on by the patient, unhurried hands of people who had 30 years of practice at building something from nothing. The galaxy did not forget what it had seen. This was what the Terran Reclamation Authority had understood and what the Coalition had not, that a demonstration, properly designed, does not require follow-up. It requires only that the right people see it and understand what it means. The right people had seen it. Some of them were still trying to work out what it meant. That was fine. They had time. On a transport bringing one of the later waves of returning colonists to Earth, a girl of 7 years old pressed her face against the viewport as the ship descended through the clouds, and the planet came into view below her. She had been born on Holdfast. She had never seen Earth except in images. She had not expected it to look like this. Real, large, textured, the cloud cover breaking here and there to show patches of green and brown and the glint of water. Her father was standing behind her, one hand on her shoulder. She looked at the planet for a long time. Then she looked up at the dark sky above the cloud layer, at the stars that were still faintly visible in the deep blue at the edge of the atmosphere. "Which one did we come from?" she asked. "Which star?" Her father looked where she was looking. The stars were many, and he had lived among them for 30 years, and he was not sure which of them she would understand if he named them. He put his hand on her head instead. "It does not matter anymore," he said. "We are going home." The ship descended through the last of the clouds, and the land came up to meet them, and Earth, patient as it had always been, waited.